evening, everyone, and welcome back to the Jewish Destiny series. I am your host, Rabbi Pinchas Landis, and let's dive right in and study some Jewish history together. So over the past number of sessions, since we spoke about the destruction of European Jewry, we were focusing heavily on the establishment of the modern state of Israel. Today I want to kind of zoom out again and take a look at what was going on in the rest of the world, because there were definitely several hundreds of thousands of refugees from World War II who had survived, and they did not go to the land of Israel. They went elsewhere in the world. And we already had a community that was starting to really pick up traction in the United States of America. Now, when we look at America, we had discussed previously how we had the huge population influx between 1880 and 1925, 1924, where about 2.5 million Russian immigrants or immigrants from Eastern Europe made their way to America. And that totally shifted the conversation in America, totally shifted what was going on. And because previously the less significant influx before the 1880s into America was mainly German Jews, secular German Jews, and before that was small groups of Sephardic Jews going all the way back to the expulsion of Spain, and or shortly after the expulsion of Spain, when Spanish Jews started making their way to South America and to North America. But the overwhelming population right now in America is Eastern European, and even that group has started to mature a little bit, because the doors were really basically shut off to Jewish immigration, to European immigration, with the Immigration Act in 1924, and that wouldn't change until the 1960s really. So even with the refugees of World War II, it was very difficult for them to get into America. From 1924 until 1965, the only way a European Jew, or European for that matter, but for sure a European Jew, could get into America was if they had a sponsor who was willing to take full financial and otherwise responsibility for this person, that they should not become a burden onto society, that if this person couldn't find a job and couldn't contribute, that the sponsor would be taking complete financial responsibility for this person. And that's how anyone who got into this country from 1924 to 1965, that's how they got here. So I know, like my grandfather, Olav Shalom, my wife's grandparents, that's how they got into this country, because that was the only way you could get into this country. Because after the Immigration Act in 1924, you couldn't just walk into this country. So, but by the time we had the conclusion of World War II, that community is already entering its second and third generation and starting to establish itself and starting to become a little bit of a force to reckon with. Now, it's interesting what happens to that community, because the Eastern Europe, unlike the German predecessors, the Eastern European community was, in Europe in general, was much more traditional. But as is often quoted by, I believe I heard it from WWII, their faith was a mile wide and an inch deep. Or as others have said it, you know why all the Jews in Rodin kept Shabbos? Because all the Jews in Rodin kept Shabbos. That was the culture. Torah observance was the culture. That had even started to change with the Enlightenment, as the Enlightenment made its way to Eastern Europe, the Haskalah. And for sure, for the majority of the 2.5 million Jews who come to America before 1924, the majority of that group is already throwing off the Jewish observance and Jewish tradition. We see the reform as becoming the dominant movement, and we'll see a little bit later on what happens to the conservative movement. Now, as far as let's just focus on the refugees for a minute. What happens with the refugees who don't go to Eretz Israel, don't go to the land of Israel? So in June of 1948, America passes the Displaced Person Act in Congress, and what this does is it authorizes 200,000 displaced persons to be able to come into the United States of America. But the way the legislation was written was such that 90% of the Jewish survivors of World War II did not fulfill the qualifications, and therefore they couldn't come in. Now, why couldn't they come in? Because 90% of the Jewish survivors had lived under the control of the Soviet Union, and therefore they were considered tainted for having lived in the Soviet areas, the Soviet Union, Poland, Hungary, the different places that became communist. Because these Jews lived in communist communist countries, they were accused of being communist sympathizers and therefore were looked at as a security risk, and even after the Displaced Persons Act in 1948, could not come into America. So what happens to the Jews who don't go to the land of Israel? They go elsewhere in the world. We see that a Jewish community is established in France, England, Australia. This is when the South African Jewish community becomes a sizable community. That's what happens. Those communities establish themselves really after World War II because those Jews have nowhere else to go in the world. And many of them, those communities thrive. There are thriving communities today in Australia. Unfortunately, the South African community has dwindled after what's happened in that country. France is dwindling with anti-Semitism there. Europe in general is not the friendliest place for Jews nowadays. But because these Jews couldn't get into America, and until 1948, it was very difficult for them to get into Israel. They could only go in illegally because the British weren't letting them in. They went elsewhere in the world, and that's where we have the establishment of the other Jewish communities in the world. Virtually, there's no Jewish community in the world that's still surviving today that really predates World War II for the most part. Again, small Jewish community in England before World War II, small Jewish community in France before World War II, as we discussed previously. But it's many of these communities are really established after World War II. Now, finally, in 1965, we have the 1965 Immigration Act, which at that point finally removes all restrictions, and that will pave the way for the eventual, with the fall of the Iron Curtain, and as it starts to crumble in the 70s and 80s, and then into the 90s, with the Jews who are caught behind the Iron Curtain after World War II, they'll be able to finally get out and go to Eretz Yisrael, of course, go to the land of Israel, and come to the United States of America. Now, as the Jewish community is becoming a force to reckon with in the United States of America. America never had the overt anti-Semitism of Europe, but definitely had a latent anti-Semitism. And this was seen in many places. This was seen in universities. Many universities had quotas of how many Jews they would let in. And it wasn't only difficult for a Jew to get into university, but when the Jew left university, getting a job wasn't always so easy. And two of the fields that always get a lot of attention is the field of law and the field of medicine, which, today, it's hard to think of in America where it was hard for Jews to become lawyers or doctors, but that was the case before, up until the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, that was definitely the case in America. Now, if we look at the legal profession as the Jews start becoming a real community in America, you had all these white shoe law firms that would not let Jews in. Even if a Jew could get through university, could get through the quotas, get through law school, they could not get a job at any of the big white shoe law firms. They explicitly did not allow the Jews in. So the situation was such that in 1950, Jews could not get jobs in law firms, and there were not yet any Jewish law firms. But this began the concept of the Jewish law firm, because the Jews essentially said, well, if you're not going to hire us to be in your law firms, we're just going to make our own law firms. And that's what happened starting in the 1960s, that by the mid-1960s, 6 of the 20 largest law firms in America were traditionally Jewish law firms. And by 1990, 4 of the 10 largest law firms in the country were traditionally Jewish law firms. Now, today, those lines have been, for the most part, disseminated. Here in Cleveland, we have actually Partners in Torah. Partners Cleveland is sponsored by the Benesch Law Firm, which is one of the traditional Jewish law firms here in Benesch. We also have Omer and Byrne, which is one of our sponsors, a traditional Jewish law firm. And we also have Jones Day based here, which was a white shoe law firm, but I know many Jews who work there now. So now those lines have blurred a lot, with the traditional Jewish law firms are not so traditionally Jewish, and the white shoe law firms now let in Jews. But that's definitely not how it looked before the 50s. Jews could not get jobs as lawyers in America. And the other place where we see that attitude a lot, and again, this is in almost every profession, but the place where it's the most well-known is also in the medical profession. Again, if the Jews could get through university, get through medical school, get through those quotas, then they had a hard time getting residencies and positions in different hospitals that would not hire Jews. Not to mention, we had other problems with hospitals in America before, even going back into the 19th century, where many of the hospitals were parochial, and Jews would be forcibly converted on their deathbed, and it was just not a good situation. So the concept of the Jewish hospital in America goes all the way back to 1854, which is where we find our first traditional Jewish hospital in America. And the purpose of it was to serve the Jews who were struggling within the community. It was a response to anti-Semitism, a response to the forced conversion, and it was a place where Jewish doctors could practice. Now, at its height, there was the way that these hospitals worked is they were always supported philanthropically by the Jewish community, and they were very much a part of the Jewish community. And at its height, there were 113 such hospitals in America. Now, definitely in big Jewish population centers, you had them, but you had them in smaller places too. In fact, if you go today to Louisville, Kentucky, you'll see, if you just drive down the highway, I believe it's Interstate 75 at that point, if I'm correct. And if you just drive down it's Interstate 85. If you drive down Interstate 85, no, I'm off. It's not 85 either. 71, I think it is. Interstate 71 in Louisville, Kentucky, you'll see right in downtown Louisville, there's Jewish Hospital of Louisville. So even small Jewish communities founded Jewish hospitals. Now, today, most of those hospitals are not Jewish anymore, and they sold out to big health conglomerates. And while there are those who still bear the names, like for example, 3 of my children were born in Mount Sinai Hospital in Baltimore, Maryland, and there's Mount Sinai Hospital in New York, and Cincinnati, where we used to live, there's still Jewish hospital. But for the most part, the hospitals have merged into larger health conglomerates, and even their names don't exist as Jewish hospitals anymore. And what this has meant quite often is a tremendous financial windfall for the Jewish community. Here in Cleveland, we have the Mount Sinai Foundation. In Cincinnati, where we used to live, there's a $300 million Jewish foundation that supports the community there, which was the windfall from selling the Jewish hospital to the Mercy Health System that it was sold to. But again, the origins were just the situation for the Jews in America. With the latent anti-Semitism, they couldn't get proper health care, and they couldn't find places of employment for the Jewish doctors. Hence the origin of the Jewish hospital in America. So when we look at America today, it's almost like the Virginia Slims commercial, "You've come a long way, baby." And we really have, when we think about the humble beginnings of the Jews in America, and really the Jews in the world as a total after World War II. I mean, we're looking at a people that a third of our population was completely annihilated by Hitler and his allies, Yamach Shemam. While we still have many challenges, in many ways, we've had a lot of success. Now, what's really most fascinating, in my humble opinion, was the renaissance of Torah Judaism that happened after World War II. Because Torah Judaism was essentially killed in Europe. It was destroyed in Europe. The great institutions, for the most part, were eradicated in Europe. The great Hasidic dynasties were eradicated in Europe. And many thought, when they were looking at America in the 50s and the 60s, that Orthodox Judaism was a thing of the past, that traditional Judaism was a thing of the past, that there's no way it could survive, that just in sheer numbers, it couldn't survive. But what happened was it's really a story of a group of individuals who in many cases, through crazy circumstances, in the case of the Litvish community, made their way to America before the war, and in the case of the Hasidic community, made their way to America after the war. We see really just the perseverance of individuals who really wouldn't take no for an answer, who wouldn't take destruction for an answer, and through just their sheer perseverance were able to rebuild Torah Judaism in America, in the land of Israel. And that's really just the fascinating story of the second part of the 20th century. How we've seen traditional Judaism, which in the 50s and 60s people thought was done for, was gone, was dead, put a fork in it, put it in the graveyard and forget about it. And we've seen that it's gone through a total renaissance. Whereas today, when we look at just the movements of the Jewish people, quote unquote, we look at traditional Judaism, we look at Reform, we look at conservative, and we look at it worldwide, the global traditional Jewish community / Orthodox Jewish community is the largest movement. When we look at America combined with the land of Israel, there's about 12 million Jews in the world today. Unfortunately, less than Less than half of them are considered "quote unquote" affiliated. So we look at the affiliated group of roughly 4 or 5 million. We have about half of that is the Orthodox Jewish community, mainly in the land of Israel, but also here in the United States of America. And it's just a tremendous renaissance that community has seen. So how did it happen? How do we see such a thing happen? Well, the backbone of the renaissance of traditional Judaism in America is really the story of the yeshivas, of the rabbinical schools, and the concept which really was changed when the Jews came to American soil and then again to the land of Israel, is that in Europe the yeshiva was really just a place for the elite. It was a place for the scholars or the potential scholars. But that changed when it became a question of Jewish survival, and they became institutions for the purpose of Jewish survival. That's what they became in America and in the land of Israel. And the culture shift was that not only would the scholars go to yeshivas, but everybody would go to either a yeshiva or a Beis Yaakov, a boys' school, a girls' school, because everyone would receive the top level of Jewish education. And as we look at the history of it, it's very interesting that the very first yeshiva in America was we talked about this in a previous lecture, was founded in 1886, and that was the Eitz Chaim Yeshiva, which eventually became the Rav Yitzchak Elchanan Theological Seminary or Yeshiva University. But that was founded in 1886. The second yeshiva was Yeshiva Rabbeinu Chaim Berlin, founded in 1904, but that in Chaim Berlin really gets its success when Rav Yitzchak Hutner comes to America in the 1930s. He comes somewhere between 1935 and 1936, and he gets a job actually as the office manager, the office manager of Yeshiva Chaim Berlin, which already existed from 1904, but his great Torah scholarship is realized, and within a few years he's given a lecture, and within a short period after that he's the dean of the yeshiva and makes it into the great Chaim Berlin yeshiva that it is today. Masifta Tiferes Yerushalayim, MTJ as it's known, founded in 1907, but really again has its glory days when Rav Moshe Feinstein Zichrono Livracha is able to immigrate from the Soviet Union to New York in 1937, and he lives out the rest of his life settling on the Lower East Side, eventually becoming the dean of the MTJ yeshiva, and really putting that yeshiva on the map as a major yeshiva. Yeshiva's Torah V'das, founded in 1918, but again, really finds its stride when Rav Shraga Feivel Mendelovich comes over to America. He's able to escape escape Europe in 1913, comes to America, and shortly after that becomes the dean of the, I believe it was in 1920s, when he becomes the head of the Torah V'das Yeshiva. Hebrew Theological College, 1922, the first yeshiva founded outside of New York, found in Chicago. We know that today is the Skokie Yeshiva. New Haven College for Talmud, founded in 1923 by Rav Sheptel Kramer. Now that was a yeshiva that did not succeed. It eventually makes its way to Cleveland, where it doesn't succeed in Cleveland either. But I mention it as a forerunner to my alma mater, Yeshivas Ner Yisrael, because the founding Rosh Yeshiva, Rav Sheptel Kramer, had a son-in-law, Rav Yitzchak Hutner. Rav Yaakov Yitzchak Ruderman, who he brought to work with him in the yeshiva in Cleveland in 1930. The yeshiva ultimately fails in Cleveland. Sometime before it fails completely, Rav Ruderman moves to Baltimore in 1933, where he becomes the rabbi of a congregation on condition that in the congregation he can start a yeshiva, and that's the founding of Yeshivas Ner Yisrael, which is my alma mater and still thrives until this very day. 1933, Yeshivas Chavetz Chaim. Rav David Leibowitz had immigrated to America. Actually, he came to America to raise money for the kollel that he was involved with in Europe, and he's offered the job as being the dean of Yeshivat Torah V'das. That ends up not being a shidduch, that's not a match, and at which point he leaves, and in 1933 he founds Yeshivas Rabbeinu Yisrael Meir HaKohen, aka the Chavetz Chaim Yeshiva. So all those yeshivas predate World War II. They're all from Lithuanian rabbis who, so to speak, saw the writing on the wall wall of Europe between the wars, because we mentioned before that Europe was no walk in the park between World War I and World War II. Many saw the writing on the wall, and those just individuals were able to see it and get out. And not to say that they were the greatest of Europe, but they were definitely great and had that perseverance to found and establish major institutions here in America. Now, what happens really during the war and after the war is really where we just see stories of sheer miracles. And one such story is a story actually of my locality here in Cleveland, and it's the story of Rav Eliemer Bloch and Rav Chaim Mordechai, aka Rav Mottel Katz, who were both of the staff of the Telz Yeshiva in Lithuania. And during the early years of World War II, before Telz, which was a town in Lithuania, was totally overtaken. Well, now it was overtaken by the Soviets, but eventually it was overtaken by the Nazis as well. And before that point, Rav Eliemer Bloch and Rav Chaim Mordechai Katz are able to come to America on a fundraising mission for the yeshiva. While they're in America, the war breaks out in Lithuania, the war breaks out in Telz, and it's clear that it's not going to be so easy for them to make it back to Telz, and what they really realized is they had to transfer the yeshiva to American soil, that there's no place in Lithuania for yeshivas anymore, and therefore they started trying to raise the money to bring the yeshiva to America. And that was really the goal. Now, we're going to talk in a minute about the miraculous story of the Mir Yeshiva and how the Mir Yeshiva, which Mir is another town in modern-day Belarus and in those days in Lithuania, and really through just a miraculous story, the Japanese consulate in Lithuania was a man named Sugihara, and he's one of the righteous Gentiles of the world, and he really works with the Jewish community to come up with a scheme to be able to get exit visas for Jews out of Lithuania, able to get them on the Trans-Siberian Railroad. Many of them end up in Shanghai. There's about 30,000 Jews, mostly saved, thousands of them were saved by Sugihara himself, who are able to sit out the war in Shanghai, China. And Shanghai at this point is actually goes under Japanese control, which was part of the Axis. That was part of Hitler's Axis, and really through just miraculous reasons, they don't turn over the Jews of Shanghai over to Hitler. Now, the story of that, just in short, is that there was a meeting of the Amshinover Rebbe and one of the Japanese officials, and the Japanese official, through a translator, asked the Amshinover Rebbe why his ally Hitler hates the Jews so much, to which the Amshinover Rebbe responded, "It's because we're Oriental." And that was enough, right? Because we're different, because we're not Aryans like him. And the Japanese official, even though he was an ally of Hitler, realized that under maybe a change of circumstances, they could also be victims of Hitler, and therefore let the Jews remain free in Shanghai throughout the war. And the Mir Yeshiva is able to, it's the only yeshiva that is able to literally transplant itself from Lithuania over the Trans-Siberian Railroad on Sugihara's, through the help of Sugihara, to get to Shanghai and to be able to reestablish yeshiva and stay there until after the war. Now, there were members of some other yeshivas who were able to tag along. So while the yeshivas aren't reestablished intact like the Mir Yeshiva, they're remnants of those yeshivas. And part of those remnants was some remnants of the Telz Yeshiva who make their way to Shanghai, and eventually after the war make their way to Brisbane, Australia. And they really plan to maybe build up the community of Brisbane when they get there. But the local Jewish community was not so into this idea of these Eastern European Torah scholars establishing a presence there. And again, they were very significant people. Rav Chaim Stein, who becomes one of the Rosh Hashivas at Telz here in Cleveland. Rav Nassim Vachvogel, who becomes the Mishkiach of the Lakewood Yeshiva. They were part of this group in Brisbane. So when the Jewish community in Brisbane realizes what they have, and these rabbis trying to reestablish the Lithuanian yeshivas in Australia, they pay for their passage to America. So what happens is this remnant of the Telz Yeshiva meets up with Rav Chaim Mordechai Katz and Rav Eliemer Bloch, and they start to look for a home. And they go to many different communities throughout America. And every community turns them away. And I'm not talking the secular community, I'm talking the whatever was the remnant of the Orthodox communities was turning them away and saying, we don't want a Lithuanian style yeshiva here. So eventually they make their way here to here to Cleveland, where the Telz Yeshiva is established in the home of the Feigenbaums. Feigenbaum family is still here in Cleveland, and eventually they build a campus in Wickliffe, Ohio, just not about 20 minutes from where I'm sitting right now, and reestablish the Telz Yeshiva here in America. And that's how the Telz Yeshiva got here. Now, it's fascinating to think about. It's one of the sort of Johnny-come-latelys in America, and that is Beis Medrash Gavoa in Lakewood. Rav Aaron Cutler Zatzal was saved by the Vad Hatzalah, by an organization that was trying to save European Jewry. He was saved and brought to America, where he eventually established the yeshiva in Lakewood, New Jersey, in 1943. And in his lifetime, it was a small yeshiva. Never was more than 250 students, but over the generations, we know how it's grown tremendously. The whole town of Lakewood has become the Jewish megatropolis of America, and the yeshiva itself has over 6,000 students today. And then the other, really, like we mentioned before, but really if we had a grandfather of yeshivas today, it would be the Mir Yeshiva in the land of Israel. Now, what happens with the Mir Yeshiva is, we just said, they're able to go to Shanghai during the war, and then after the war, they actually, they basically split up. Some come here to America, where they establish the Mir Yeshiva in Brooklyn, and some make their way to the land of Israel, where the Mir Yeshiva is established in the land of Israel, and it becomes the largest yeshiva in the world, over 9,000 students, many, many buildings in the Beis Yisrael section of Yerushalayim, and it's become really it's the grandfather of yeshivas, if you will, in the land of Israel, and really in the world as a whole. And it's a miraculous story, as we said, how they were saved in Shanghai during the war. They reestablished themselves in Shanghai for the war years, and then reestablished themselves and built themselves into such a institution of higher learning here in the land of Israel. Now, in 1944, we have the establishment of an organization called Torah U'Mesorah. Torah U'Mesorah is the National Society for Hebrew Day Schools, and it was organized when there had already been the concept of Jewish day schools had already been established, and again, really just through the perseverance of a few individuals here in Cleveland, Rav Nachum Dessler, the son of the Michtam Eleo, Rav Elio Dessler, in Detroit, and a few other places. You had the beginning of these Jewish day schools, but the idea here was a group of Jewish community leaders came together, and they made an organization that was going to be focused on establishing Jewish day schools in every single Jewish community in America. And it was spearheaded by Rav Shraga Feivel Mendelevich, who we mentioned before was the dean of the Torah Vodaas Yeshiva, and he not only brings together a handful of day schools, but really almost goes door to door, community to community, establishing day schools wherever can, collecting kids, going door to door, knocking on doors, looking for kids, so that the Jewish communities in America should not be abandoned. It was really through his perseverance and with his successors that within 2 years there were almost 100 day schools in America, and almost 250 day schools within 15 years by the year 1960. And by that point there's already an enrollment of almost 50,000 students. Now, when we look at today, we have over 750 day schools under the Torah U'Mesorah banner of over 250,000 students. All that is, again, happening and established in this time in post-war America. Now, the Hasidic community, virtually the entirety of the Hasidic community is wiped out in Europe. Now, there's different reasons for that, why, but for the most part, no one leaves before the war, unlike these really Yechidim, these just few exceptional people who left within the Lithuanian community, and the Hasidic community, no one leaves before the war. And it's only after, during the war, after the war, through some who escape, some who survive, the great Hasidic dynasties, which are completely eradicated by Hitler, those great Hasidic Hasidic dynasties were able to rebuild themselves in America and in the land of Israel. The most famous of them, probably here in America, the biggest here in America, is probably the Satmar Hasidim, founded by Rav Yoel Teitelbaum, who was the Satmar Rav in Europe, and really only survives the Nazi onslaught in Hungary because he was able to find his way onto the infamous Kazner train. He goes to Switzerland. He first goes to the land of Israel, tries to establish his Chassidus in the land of Israel. After a year being in the land of Israel, his institutions go bankrupt, and then he immigrates to America and establishes the Satmar Chassidim first in Williamsburg, and then with their satellite community in Monroe, New York, known as Kiryas Yo. The community is now named after him. And today, the Satmar Chassidim is about 26,000 households. And when you figure those households are each of about 10 to 12 people, you're talking about 250,000 Satmar Chassidim here in America from a group that was basically completely eradicated by Hitler. In America, we also have the WWII Chassidim, also a very large group. Where Shlomo Halberstam survives the camps, is able to come here to America, reestablish his family's Chassidus that was eradicated in Europe, and also a huge Chassidus in Europe. In Brooklyn today. We have the Skver Chassidim just in New Square, New York. We have the Belzer Chassidim in Eretz Yisrael, and on and on and on. We have the Lubavitch Chassidim, who are located. Their headquarters in Crown Heights, but they have their emissaries all over the world. And all of that is really coming from a group that was basically destroyed in Europe, but there were individuals that either survived or able to get out, and literally just through their perseverance are able to rebuild the dynasties that had been extinguished in Auschwitz, Birkenau, Treblinka, etc. Now, this is the renaissance of traditional Judaism in America. What happens elsewhere in America is by 1948, the conservative movement has officially abandoned its connection to traditional Judaism, meaning from its establishment in the 1920s for the first 30 years, it's in a sort of a little bit of a dance with the traditional community as to, is it going to be part of the same community? Is it not going to be part of the same community? You would have graduates of the Jewish Theological Seminary, those affiliated with conservative Judaism, that would take pulpits in Orthodox synagogues. You would have graduates from Yeshiva University that would take pulpits in conservative congregations. But by 1948, it's clear, because they make the conservative movement makes a clear line in the sand that they will not be beholden to Talmudic law anymore, and they now establish the community of law and standards, and they have the break from the traditional Masorah, if you will, from that point. But in post-war America, the conservative movement explodes, because for a lot of these Eastern European Jews that had already been here for a generation or two, and for sure those who are able to come in after the war, they want to move out to. This is the beginning of suburban America, and these conservative synagogues go out to the suburban communities, and they no longer require people to drive to walk to shul. They can drive on Shabbos. So it just takes with the Eastern European Jew, who they can go to a synagogue that kind of still feels traditional, like their synagogue did in Europe, but the rabbi's not going to look down on them for driving to synagogue and maybe not keeping a kosher home and sending their kids to public school, and it really just explodes. And it hits its peak in 1970, at that point claiming more than 40% of American Jewish households. At that point, about 2 million Jews belong to the conservative movement. But at that point, the work of all those that we had mentioned before, Rav Aaron Kotler, Rav Yaakov Yitzchak Ruderman, Rav Yitzchak Kutner, Rav David Leibowitz, Rav Shraga Feivel Mendelovich, etc., the Satmar Rav, the Belzer Rav, the Bubba Rav, the Skver Rav, etc., their renaissance is really taking hold by the 70s, and we'll talk about this more in future sessions. So we see the success of the conservative movement start to dwindle, and it never really recovers from that point as the Orthodox community makes a comeback. Today, the conservative movement is probably less than a million people, and whereas the Orthodox number about 250,000 in the world, with Reform at about 2 million in the world. And that essentially is how we see American Jewry take shape after World War II. Now, if we add up those numbers I just gave you, a million conservative, 250,000 Orthodox, and 2 million Reform, that only gives you 5.5 million. Whereas estimates are that there are about 10 to 12 million Jews in the world today. More than half of them are in the land of Israel now. Where are the other 5 million? And unfortunately, that the largest movement of Jews really after the war became the movement of assimilation. And now we see that while in those initial generations after the war, most of these Jews probably did belong to congregations and try to raise their kids Jewish, but by now, with already decades now of 60-70% intermarriage, unfortunately the largest group is assimilation, the assimilationists, and it's really sad when we think about it, because while I don't want to say it was conscious decisions of these families in all situations, but they really continued the work of Hitler. Hitler eradicated 6 million Jews in Europe, and we've seen we have about 6 million Jews today that we can somewhat identify as Jewish still that aren't going to be here next generation because of the full assimilation. And that's one of that's on all of us. It's on all of us who still really care about our Judaism to look at that and say, this might be the last generation to save them. And within a generation, our numbers, okay, with birth rates, maybe they'll stay somewhat the same. But you look at a Jewish people today that's still 10 to 12 million people, just like we were at the turn of the 20th century. And that should give us all pause, and really we should look at each and every single one of us and ask the questions that we'll talk soon about probably next session or in 2 sessions about the Kiruv movement in America, the Jewish outreach movement in America that will establish itself after the 6-Day War, which we'll talk about next week. And one of the main leaders of that movement, Rav Noach Weinberg, used to ask every single Jew he met. He would say, "What are you doing for the Jewish people?" And I think that's a question we all have to ask ourselves. What are we doing for the Jewish people? If you're watching this lecture tonight, you obviously care about the Jewish people at some level, but for every one of you, there's 1 or 2 or 3 of you just like you out there who don't care about the Jewish people and don't care about that connection to the Jewish people and are just as happy letting their chain going back to Mount Sinai be completely severed. And the question is, what are you going to do about it? And I think that's a question we have to ask ourselves, that while we've seen really a renaissance of traditional Judaism after World War II, we've also seen tremendous attrition of the Jewish people. And that is on each and every single one of us to try and do something to bring in Achenu B'nai Yisrael, to bring in our brothers and sisters who are disenchanted with Judaism and to get them connected to our Jewish people so they realize what a beautiful heritage they have, and hopefully they decide not to just throw it all away. And let's all make a commitment to do that. I want to thank you all for joining us tonight. It's been a fun time being with you as always. And tune in next week where we will shift our focus back to the land of Israel and talk about the 6-Day War. I look forward to discussing it with you. Everyone have a wonderful evening and a wonderful week. Thank you.